Welcome to the tent on Pilgrims and Promised Lands. The journey to the Promised Land is right at the heart of the Bible, in the promise to Abraham and Sarah in Genesis, and the dramatic escape from Egypt in Exodus. A journey through the wilderness to a land flowing with milk and honey, a land for their own possession. As the Pilgrims set out on the Mayflower 400 years ago, they saw themselves as a new Israel, travelling to their own land of promise. There is an amazingly powerful moment as the Pilgrims stood on the threshold of their journey, leaving behind the little congregation in Leiden in the Netherlands. Among those waving them off was their pastor, John Robinson, who was aware that he would not enter the new world with them, and spoke words of great vision. The Lord hath yet more light and truth to break forth from his holy word. He must have had in his mind the experience of Moses standing on the threshold of the Promised Land in the book of Exodus, saying farewell to the people with whom he journeyed so far, out of slavery in Egypt, through the wilderness, but knowing that he would not go with them into the land promised by God. What were the Pilgrims escaping from? Like the Israelites, they were on a wilderness journey, leaving behind not slavery, but persecution, intolerance, the ability to practice their faith, danger of prosecution, fines, even imprisonment or death. What were they going to? Well, a land flowing with milk and honey, the Bible said. The chance to build a new life, to establish a new community, men, women and children together on principles of godliness and openness. But there was a shadow side to the promise. The Israelites were told that the land would be their possession. They were the chosen people of God, and God would drive out before them, slaughter and destroy the tribes who inhabited the land. At first, we read that the Pilgrims lived peaceably with the inhabitants of the land. In fact, if they hadn't, the little colony would soon have died out. But they and others coming from Europe brought with them diseases which wiped out whole populations, and an attitude of hostility towards the so-called Indians, who were simply not part of their divine narrative. Unlike almost any other place on earth, modern America has the ideal of the Promised Land in its DNA. The Statue of Liberty calls the world's huddled masses to find hope and freedom there. Its songs celebrate it as the land of the free and the home of the brave. But the writer of those words believed that they applied to white people only, that those of First Nations or African origins were inferior. America has inherited the whirlwind as well as the sunshine. And at least one strand of that DNA has been contributed by the people of these islands. From the times of the Puritans onward, as the world opened up in front of us, the British people have seen themselves as the chosen race. Not just the land, but the world belonged to us. On one hand, we felt the call to save the nations, and on the other, we traded on a global scale. Sugar, cotton, tea, people, slaves. So in this tent, you will find clips from 3 interviews. The full interview in each case is on the website. First, Joe Nockels talks to the Reverend Dr. Peggy Bendroth, former director of the Congregational Library in Boston, Massachusetts, and historian. He asks how the story of the Pilgrims was shaped and built into the America of today. A huge part of that story is the impact of the vile trade in enslaved people and the struggle for freedom. I invited the Reverend Dr. Lottie Jones Hood to tell us about her church in Detroit, which was on the Underground Railroad, the network of escape routes that led from the southern states, where people were still enslaved, into the north of America, and then across the river to Canada and freedom. Their story was interpreted in the language of the flight from Egypt, across the Jordan to the Promised Land. Finally, I talked to the Reverend Dr. Manfred Cole, an American congregational minister, world traveler, and passionate educationalist who came to America from post-war Germany. We end with words from Martin Luther King on the eve of his own assassination, with his own vision of a promised land. When you have listened to these, and perhaps viewed the full interviews, please feel free to contact me. What do you think the promised land is for our time? Is it a dream of freedom and justice? Or is there still a danger that it becomes a way of keeping others out?
And we wanted to get your take on the time in New England after the Pilgrims first settled. So I was wondering if you could give us a sense of the trajectory and the chronology from the 17th century to the 19th century, in little snippets, and how we get to congregationalism in the 19th century from the Pilgrims. That might be too broad, I don't know.
Yeah, and I'm not a colonial historian, so I would just say that the project here in the colonies in New England, it was in some sense fairly chaotic, because if you look at the records that we do have, of people having ecclesiastical councils and all those kinds of things up through the 19th century, there was no one to say that's not how you do it. And if there was a problem in a local church and they called a council, to settle it with outside people, as per the manuals, or such as they were. Well, there were no manuals. If the council didn't decide what they wanted, they just call another council. So, in one sense, Congregationalism was the established religion in New England, but yet it was extremely local. So it's kind of hard to say exactly, what the practice was like, because, up until the 19th century, there were no manuals, there were no guidebooks. There was just, churches would consult with each other and say, what do you do? And then just kind of work it out that way. So, I don't know if that answers your question, but it was, kind of a funny thing where you're the established church, such as it was, but,
Yeah, the actual organization behind it.
You're also extremely, local to different New England towns and communities in terms of what congregationalism actually meant.
Yeah, I think that would be quite reminiscent for a lot of people watching this of their church meetings and perhaps the disunity that happens there, because I guess that's part of the thinking, is it's so localized that it's supposed to be so focused on that particular community.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the reasons that we're so glad to have you share your thoughts as well is because of your book, which I had the privilege to use for my own work. So The Last Puritans, Mainline Protestants and the Power of the Past. And I found that a big part of that book was you talking about 19th century Congregationalists using the Pilgrims as kind of a device to keep people together and read traditions. And I wonder if that's because people in the congregation were confronting these realities and they did need this kind of binding agent, this glue. So I'm wondering if you could, expand on that a bit. That would be great.
Yeah, that was my sense of things, that, Americans in general did not record or value their history well into the 19th century. And so, we have horrific stories of, just barrels of state documents being thrown into the Potomac because, what do we need these for? This was where history was going to start over, and, why do we keep this stuff? And so, the Pilgrims were no big deal. People didn't really, the town of Plymouth would commemorate them with, a lot of drinking and sermons and the kind of typical thing. but there was not this sense that we're building on this particular past. So it's really, around about 1820, the 200th anniversary, when politicians and church people begin to deploy this story for national purposes. And, Daniel Webster's famous sermon or speech, I guess you could say, in Plymouth in 1820, ties the Pilgrims to the pioneer myth, that these are, the first pioneers, and they saw, metaphorically across the continent, and it's that same spirit that's empowering the pioneers, that empowered the Pilgrims, which is, kind of doubtful, but so there's a political reason for this. But for Congregationalists, what could be better than tying yourself to that powerful national myth, as you are kind of losing your established status in New England? Owning the story is a form of cultural privilege in the 19th century. It means that you are, white. There's kind of a racial component to this, that you are, there's a social class component to this, that you are not immigrant or brown, or uneducated, but you are the keepers of this founding myth in American culture. But, we spent a great deal of time thinking about this and preparing for this. And of course, we had events planned and all these other kind of wonderful things. But we did put together a 4-part curriculum for churches. And I would stress to people that it was about being historically responsible. It's not about trashing them. That's, just judging them by 21st century standard. It's not fair. But yet there is a moral accounting for all of us and our actions, even, long term. And it's not about adulating them. I mean, you just find people at one or two extremes. And so the curriculum that we developed and the programming that we developed, we tried to use that word, historically responsible. We're going to make sure that people know the story, because so much historical commemoration is not about the past. The town, one of the reasons we did this, because the town of Plymouth, had this whole big celebration. It was like fishing derbies and flower festivals and parades. Like, it was all about today. And oh yeah, then there were the Pilgrims, but yeah, and that was, we don't know what to say about that. So, we've had historians, on the board and in our orbit who were, careful to tell the story with the appropriate nuance and factual, basis for it. And then you can see that, just like today, the past was ambiguous and complex, and there's personal agency of people in some ways, and in other ways not. We're all formed by our circumstances.
I'll say thank you so much. And
yeah, good luck to your project.
Did you know that the first enslaved people actually came over before the Pilgrims? And that was in 1619, and the Pilgrims came in 1620.
So say some more about that then. They came in 1619, the first.
Yes, Jamestown, Virginia. That was when the first enslaved people came over. And then, of course, the Pilgrims came over in 1620. So
yeah.
The difference is, of course, we came over, and how we came. We came in the hold of the boat,
yes,
and the Pilgrims came on the decks. So there's a little story that goes with it, and that was that the master, if you will, people were escaping. People were being missed. The enslaved people were being missed. And he said one day that they just got away so slick. It was almost like they got on some kind of underground railroad and escaped. And that's where that term is supposed to have come from. But actually, it was just a system of trailways and routes that they used to get from one place to another place. And there were various different houses that they went to and so forth. And they called it underground, really, because it was not open and obvious so that people could see it. That's what the term really means. One of the most important stations in Detroit was headed by Seymour Finney, owner of Finney's Hotel at Woodward and Gratiot, with the hotel barn at State and Griswold. At first, there was a profound secrecy about the goings-on, but Seymour continued to do all he could as he considered slavery contrary to justice and humanity. The basement of First Congregational Church at Fort and Wayne Street was used to hide refugees en route to boats at the foot of Wayne Street, known now as Washington Boulevard, smuggling them across to Windsor. Popular sentiment rallied to Finney's support. Many times when the hotel housed pursuing masters, Finney was lodging the slaves in his barn. It is said that grateful Black men sometimes assumed Finney's name after their arrival in Canada. And Detroit was called Midnight because you slept here in Detroit at midnight, and when you woke up the next day, you were free. You crossed over the river.
And crossing the river.
Yes, and as I said, I live on the river, and right out there is the river. I live on the river.
And that was the river that led to freedom.
Yes. Yeah.
Was there a sense that these people would have been Christians, they were brought up with a knowledge of the Bible? Was there a sense that it's not just physically becoming free, but actually reaching a kind of promised land, a chance to make a new life and to begin over again?
Yes, there was. Well, you must understand what slavery is. Slavery, and I looked it up just before, a few minutes ago. Slavery is involuntary subjugation of one person to another, complete control of another, absolute control. You can do whatever you want to that person. Can you imagine what that must have felt like? To not own yourself, to have someone be able to beat you or shoot you or whip you. And there's that Detroit River, and down there, there is a place, there's a book entitled, it's called The Fluid Frontier. And this was the Detroit River was a fluid frontier. It was the way for people to go from here in the United States across that little short span of that river to freedom.
I'm Manfred Kohl. I was born right in the middle of the Second World War in 1942. When I grew up in Germany, I was born into a family that made furniture. And so when I grew up, it was a very difficult time right after the war. I know what starvation meant. I know how we had to struggle for food for several years. And the highlight was when we got some care packages that came from North America. We thought that's the promised land. And that was always in my mind as I grew up. So I learned my trade as a cabinet maker and was very happy as I learned how to make my tools, how to make a masterpiece, and how to become a master cabinet maker. But then I felt I should leave home, leave all the restriction and all the requirements. I was looking around the world, where could I go for a few years just to find out what would be the future of my life. I went to Africa, I went to Asia, I went to the Middle East. But then I went for 2 years to North America. I arrived in New York. I did not even know the language, but I know how to work as a cabinet maker, as making furniture, good furniture. And I immediately got a job. Within 3 days, I was employed. After 1 month, I was a foreman in a furniture factory, and I was very, very excited. And that's when I came in contact with the congregational idea. I studied the Pilgrims, and knowing that they also came first from Holland and from England to go to the New World to start something new, to have a new beginning. I identify myself with them more than with the Lutheran that I was brought up or the Calvinistic tradition. I felt I want to be much more free and independent, just like the ideas of congregationalism. I was following that dream of absolute freedom, of independence, of achieving things that you could achieve nowhere else. But then I discovered it's not as easy as everyone thinks and dreams of. After my teaching assignment and after I got my doctorate degree, I felt I'd like to serve people. And for several years, my family and I, we had 2 boys, my wife, the 2 boys and I, we went to Africa. We spent several years in West Africa. I was the regional director for humanitarian agency World Vision. But what I learned in Africa is that relationship is much more important than freedom. Relationship with people, to understand where they are, to sit with them and to feel with them and to have fun and joy and pain with them. That made my life much more richer and much more valuable. I also had to learn that in the free world, the idea of integrity is a big issue. If you become your own master, if you become completely free and you make all the decisions, integrity is an issue that sometimes has to be greater emphasized, and people have to learn what it means to be humble, to be a servant, surely to be leaders and to achieve a lot, but to turn around and learn to be more a servant. So all my dreams that I had as a child, growing up in a time that Hitler destroyed the entire country and socialism has had a tremendous impact on its population. I have now the fulfillment of seeing that my life is worth something, that I can be respected and respect others. I personally think that I have a real, exciting, fulfilling, joyful life. And that is Manfred Kohl.
I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.